Small Changes by Digits 27, Chapter 29, Familiar Fights. Luckily, Naruto made it the rest of the way to the amphitheater without any more distractions. It was rather a marvelous structure, seemingly carved out of the side of a cliff face with one side entirely dominated by sweeping semicircular benches wrought straight from the stone. A single waterfall fell from a specially constructed aqueduct on the side with the cliff and down through an enormous steel grating, likely to swirl away down into the tunnel system below. The stadium itself was packed to the brim with people, all of them looking anxious and excited for what was to come. Tuning exams in the minor villages were always friendlier affairs, none of the bickering and political infighting that came with the larger territories. A more diverse range of people and nationalities couldn't have been found anywhere else. People from Tsuki no Kuni and Hi no Kuni brushed shoulders without turning on each other with weapons. A few nobles from Mizu no Kuni could even be seen, their recognizable robes standing out amidst the more common garb of the general folk from the surrounding countrysides. Naruto couldn't help the broad grin that split his face and lightly stretched his thin whisker marks. This was the peace and brotherhood his father had wanted. No national borders, no village propaganda, no petty grudges, only marked by the insignia on one's forehead. This was unadulterated, beautiful humanity at its finest. Of course, nothing that perfect could have lasted forever, as a moment later the redhead was tapped lightly on the shoulder. He turned, still spotting his grin, only to spot the Konoha Jonin he vaguely recognized due to him hanging around hanging out the Hokage quite a bit. "Ah, Raido, was it?" the redhead inquired, trying not to stare at the rather distinct scarring across the left side of the man's face that almost looked like the branching bolts of a lightning strike, quite fitting considering his name. "Yes, Namikaze-san," Raido replied with a nod, seeming rather dismissive in the way he spoke. At least he didn't call him Sama. "The Hokage wishes to speak with you." His message delivered, Raido quickly walked off. None of the foreign shinobi would risk using a Shunshin surrounded by this many tugging in. Naruto just blinked at the abrupt request, his eyes panning over to the raised platform at the back of the amphitheater, where the Hokage sat amongst a few others. The redhead frowned, having wanted to at least speak to his team before the test began, but unfortunately he couldn't go against a direct request from the Hokage. A minute later, and he was allowed up onto the Kage seating area after a rather irritating and heated discussion with the young Chunin guarding it. It baffled Naruto why that was even required. They were Kage, they could definitely defend themselves just fine, even if they couldn't what Hope did a single or even a squad of Chunin hope to do against a force that overwhelming. Still, Naruto managed to finally convince the young man that had been invited up, walking up the short flight of stairs to the welcome smile of the Sundame. "Ah, Naruto, no trouble getting here, I presume?" The old man smirked knowingly, a twinkle in his eye as he greeted the redhead. Naruto simply waved the cheeky Kage off dismissively. The old man knew too much for his own good. "Of course not, Hiruzen," Naruto shot back with just as much cheekiness. These types of back and forth were rather common lately, with Naruto hanging around the Hokage Tower as often as he did. My, Hokage-sama, I didn't realize you allowed your subordinates to speak with you so familiarly." A smooth, feminine voice suddenly spoke up, drawing Naruto's eyes over towards what could only be described as an image of absolute beauty, her long, auburn hair falling down her back in a messy waterfall and tied up over her right eye in order to give Naruto a seductive wink. Likewise, she shifted in her seat to better face him, pushing out her ample chest and rustling her rather beautiful blue dress so that it fell down even lower than its already scandalous neckline. However, Naruto had grown used to similarly outright displays of femininity and offered a polite smile in return, seemingly perturbing the woman. "Naruto Namikaze, Mizukage-sama," the redhead greeted with a short inclination of his head, enough to show respect, not enough to show any difference. The smooth and easy reply seemed to iron over whatever had been upsetting the woman, who was clearly the new leader of Kirigakure, given the blue, wide-brimmed hat dropped over her back of her chair. She seemed to forgo that the traditional robes, though, much to the gratitude of many men in the arena. The simply white robes were hardly flattering for such an outstanding figure. Naruto didn't voice this, of course. He had already done enough to aggravate Uncle on this little trip. Yes, I could certainly see why you would be able to put up with a bit of disrespect in his case, Hokage Dono. Would you mind terribly if I were to borrow him just for the proceedings, of course? The Mizukage added with a sly, sultry smirk, gently patting the spot on the rather comfortable-looking and large chair she was draped across. Naruto's eyes only widened a fraction as he looked across at the Hokage with a subtle, pleading look. The old man's eyes were sparkling with mirth. Yes, Naruto-kun is somewhat of a special case. Mizukage Dono, what with him being my chosen successor, the man piped up, looking quite pressed with himself as he chewed his pipe thoughtfully. I'm sure he would be more than willing to entertain you for the length of the exams. Am I right? He turned back to the redhead and missed the brief look of shock on her face, aside into a more calculating, sly expression. Quick as a flash, she slid forward, and hand going to Naruto's shoulder as she set him a as she set him a small but noticeable wink. Please call me May. Being called Mizukage all the time becomes so awful dry, despite Ao's insistence. Some distance away, the man that looked to be guarding the Mizukage, who Naruto recognized to be the very same hunter nin he and his team met in, Nami twitched. So you're the Naruto Namikaze I've had the pleasure of hearing all about. Naruto smiled, ignoring the hand on his shoulder for the moment. All good things, I hope, he replied with some humor, causing the Mizukage to laugh, a twinkling, whimsical sound that was a delight on the ears, even if it did sound just a little forced. Quite, she acquiesced, backing off, much to Naruto's internal appreciation, and allowing the Hokage to introduce the man standing to his side. He was a gruff-looking man, older than Naruto and Mai, but not quite approaching the Sandame's age. His hair still had color, but was definitely graying on the sides, giving him a distinguished, steeled appearance. Naruto, this is Shibaro Dono, the current leader of Takegakure. Hiruzen instructed with a closed-eye smile. The redhead could feel the slight tension between the two older men as he reached forward and took Shibaro's hand. A pleasure, the redhead initiated politely, as the older man simply nodded curtly. I'm sure, the village leader replied in a gruff tone that perfectly matched his hardened appearance. He didn't have any guards up on the platform, or at least didn't appear to, but then they were standing in the middle of his village. Well then, now that the instructions are over, I believe the matches are about to begin. The Hokage quickly interjected, and sure enough, when they turned, the first two teams were making their way out onto the field. Naruto felt a hint of pride swell up in his chest as he saw his team standing down there, determination flaming in their eyes as they faced down the team from Iwagakure. So I assume the Tsuchikage will not be joining us, Mei interjected softly as the Kage and their various guards retired to their seats again, much to Naruto's chagrin. Before he could take up a position behind the Sandame's chair, he was dragged across the small platform and forced to sit next to Mei. He sent looks at the old man, but he only returned them with amused smirks he knew would only serve to irritate Naruto. Ah, no, Onoki rarely makes the journey from Irakakuri anymore, much too strain on his hip, I assume, Hiruzen responded placidly, a small unspoken sigh escaping his lips. Naruto knew the man always considered the intense rivalry between Iwa and Konoha one of his greatest failings. After all, he had watched his entire life as a small flame of a grudge was fueled into a roaring bonfire, culminating in Naruto's own father's actions in the Third Shinobi War. Well then, perhaps it is time for him to step down. Mei shot back with a smirk, leaning back quite comfortably in her chair and uncomfortably close to Naruto. Don't you think, Naruto? He also didn't appreciate the sudden familiarity, especially if he would be working with this woman in the future if he were to take the title. I really can't say, nor is it my business to, the redhead replied neutrally, only receiving a pout for his troubles. But surely, as Hokage Dono's successor, you must have opinions on the political situation? May inquired innocently, her single visible eye looking up at him. Half lidded, he was sure she must have practiced that look quite a bit. Well, Naruto started glancing across at the Hokage only to see him looking down at the stadium, his lips quirking up ever so slightly. Traitor! The Tsuchikage is definitely not one to be underestimated. My father never faced him personally, but his journals only have praise and respect for the man. Naruto was just glad that he had never had to face the man. He was certain the name Namikaze didn't exactly carry much warmth in Tsuji no Kuni. But you don't think he is getting a bit too on in years to successfully manage an entire hidden village? May inquired again, her eyelids fluttering. She pulled off the meek, innocent woman quite well. It was a shame then that Naruto had decided to research a bit into her after hearing her name in Nami. She had quite the decoration history in the Kiri Civil War. Hiruzen is just as old as the Tsuchikage, and Konoha could not ask for a better leader. Naruto replied instantly. It was more of a knee-jerk reaction when surrounded by so many foreigners. "Oh, you flatter me, Naruto," Hiruzen piped in mirthfully. "But the Hokage also stepped down some years ago. He recognized there was somebody better in your father, no less." May stated matter-of-factly, and Naruto had to wonder why she was being so intense about this. Maybe the situation is not the same in Iwa, who's to say? Naruto finally replied, a little lamely, all things considered. Really, he just wanted to watch his team fight and maybe spend a little bit of time trading banter with the other sensei. It was what he had come here to do. All this politics was already exhausting him. Did being a leader always mean being this fake? Or maybe it was different when you were already in a position of power and not having to make a good showing of yourself like he was now. He supposed that he would only find out if he was able were to accept Hiruzen's offer. Ha! May simply threw her hands back and let out a short but still somehow feminine bark of a laugh before nodding in satisfaction. "An answer worthy of a politician. I think you would make a fine Kage Namikaze-san. Tales of your abilities only support this." The redhead was surprised by the sudden shift in her personality. Feeling as though he had somehow been duped, May leaned away from him, settling into a more comfortable position in her chair as all eyes turned down to the stadium. "This is your team, if I am to understand, right, Namikaze-san?" May spoke up again, just as the proctors had come down and the match started, both teams rushing into action in an instant. Naruto gave a quick nod, eyes locked on his team as Sasuke and Ame rushed in together, Sakura hanging back and cycling quickly through hand seals. Then I certainly look forward to seeing how they fare. A student does speak a lot about their sensei after all, whether they realize it or not. Naruto quirked an eyebrow at the vague statement, only to see May looking down at the fight again. It was over rather quickly, all things considered. Like his own team, the Iwa had adopted a two in the front, one in the back strategy. However, unlike Sasuke and Ame, their frontliners seemed to be ninjutsu types, which was not a good matchup in the limited space of the arena. While Sakura confused and disoriented their support team member before they could do whatever it was they were planning, Sasuke and Ame showed their great teamwork in getting right up close to the remaining two. They would switch targets seemingly at random, keeping them occupied to stop them performing hand seals while switching about at random to keep them confused. Then it was all just a matter of who was faster, and that really wasn't a contest when students of a Namikaze were involved. Neither Iwa Genin even Neither Iwageni even managed to get off a single jutsu to try and turn the tide of the battle. It all ended when Sasuke and Ami managed to tie them up together with a surprisingly effective use of ninja wire. Then it was a simple matter of ganging up on the last one. Just like that, it was over, and Naruto was sporting a massive grin on his features. Well, that was certainly an impressive and swift showing. Rather appropriate, I'd say, May commented with a smirk. Always happy to see Iwagakure defeated in any capacity. There was no love lost between Iwa and Kiri, that was for sure. My mentors were rather fond of the idea of the younger generation rising up and surpassing their elders. Hiruzen sighed nostalgically. He always did enjoy seeing the bright lights the youth represented at these exams. Well, I'd say they are far shot off right now, but they look promising enough. May returned with a closed eye smile. I expected nothing less from your team, Namikaze-san. She continued, eyeing up Naruto's reaction, only to raise an eyebrow as he scratched the back of his head sheepishly. Well, there only is so much I can do with what's already there. Each of them are unique in their own way. I can only nurture them and provide a bit of guidance, he muttered quietly. It was still rather strange to be praised for his students' accomplishments. However, May seemed delighted, patting him on the chest and laughing again. Oh, and modest too. If you weren't of a foreign village, I'd snatch you right up, she joked, although there seemed to be an underlying hint of something more there as she leaned forward to better look at the Hokage. Hokage Dono? The old man chuckled fondly, puffing on his pipe. I'm afraid the village needs him, Mizukaze Dono. Terribly sorry, he replied, paying no mind as May sat back with a playful pout. Shame! They settled down as the next teams arrived. Much to Naruto's amusement, it was Kurenai squad up against the trio from Taki, which seemed to draw Shibaro's attention. However, that attention turned sour when it was apparent just how outclassed the group from Taki really were. Teammate was surprisingly brutal, with Hinata taking the lead as she broke the other squad's ranks quickly enough. She simply injected herself among them, cutting off cutting off their tenketsus and scattering them to prevent further losses. Then Kiba came into play, bouncing around the small amphitheater and making the most of the enclosed space with the Inuzaka trademark Gatsuga. Him and his Ninken were twin whirlwinds of destruction, carving through the separated Taki Genin before they could regroup. Finally, Shino, in typical Aburama fashion, mopped up what was left and made sure they stayed down by draining away the rest of the chakra. Shibaro seemed rather irked by the poor showing from his team, but so far it only showed off Konoha in a good light. Well, Konoha certainly seems to have the upper hand in these exams. However, I think that is about to change. May cut in with a smirk, staring knowingly down at the stadium floor as the next group were led on. Oh, and what makes you so certain, Mizukage Dono? The Hokage quipped as he blew out a small ring of smoke, sun-stained eyes peering down at the two new squads. If my age isn't catching up to me, one of those teams is under the care of my son, the latest generation of the Inoshika Cho. Naruto looked down in interest, and sure enough, spotted Asuma's team take the floor, having to practically drag on one of their teammates in the typical Nara fashion. However, what interested him more was the figure he recognized on the opposite team bearing the insignia of Kirikakure. He began to understand why Mei bore such a confident air. Because, Hokage Dono, that is the first Genin squad from Kirigakure to ever grace the Chunin exams, and naturally, I only chose the best. She shot back with a smirk firmly passed on her delicately arranged features. Naruto felt a little sorry for Asuma. Facing up against the young shinobi like Haku in the first round was not going to end well, especially if the boy had only improved since their last meeting in Nami. His thoughts were only proving correctly as the match developed, much to the Mizukage's obvious pleasure. Admittedly, the Konoha trio did put up a good showing. They display foresight, tactics, and some good on-the-fly planning on Shikamaru's part. It was to be expected from such well-worn and battle-tested tactics utilizing their clan's abilities to their fullest. However, it became painfully obvious that such tactics were very much used to capturing single targets, which they did a few times. However, the Kirigakure Genin showed remarkable aptitude for springing these traps only to dismantle them a moment later. Haku's speed far surpassed any other Genins in the exam, save perhaps Sasuke's, and that was more on Naruto's pride as a teacher more than anything else. He simply proved to be uncatchable despite Shikamaru's placed plans. Naruto at least thought Asuma could take solace in the fact it was teaching the Konoha Genin a valuable lesson. Sometimes you could face power that simply surpasses anything you could plan for or on such short notice. And maybe it was just Haku they might have been able to scratch out a victory. They very nearly caught him too with a clever trick involving the faint shadow cast by the waterfall. However, Haku was not their only problem. The Mizukage did not lie when she said Kiri had brought their best. The other male member of the team, by all rights a rather nervous looking boy with light blue hair, proved to be just as much of a problem. It was evident why, even without him doing anything, the sharpened shark-like teeth and enormous blade he carried gave that much away. "A swordman in training?" Naruto inquired, looking around at the albert-haired woman to his right. He was unsure of how to actually address her. Mizukage-sama would show deference. Dono would simply would imply they were equals, which could not be true unless he was a Kage, and Mei. He was not calling her Mei. Yes, Chojuro, a remarkably young boy, one of the most skilled wielders of Hiramekare Kiri has seen in generations, the woman stated proudly, and it showed. Supposedly one of the harder weapons of the mist to wield due to its unpredictable nature and enormous chakra drain, and Chojuro was swinging it around with only minor strain. The last member of the team, a rather heavily bundled Kunoichi, was not so obvious with her skill and stayed hanging at the rear of her squad, usually behind the protective arc of Chojiro's blade. She didn't seem to be doing all that much to a casual observer, but based on the confused expression Team 10 occasionally donned, as well as the glazed look that sometimes overcame Shikamaru's eye when he was about to bring a meticulous plan together, she was a rather skilled genjutsu user. She seemed to be the linchpin of whatever subtle tactics the Kiri team used, disorienting the other team at the opportune moments for Chojuro to make an opening for Haku to attack with his blinding speed. It was rudimentary but lethally effective. It was one of the longer matches, mostly due to Shikamaru stringing things along as much as he could until finally driving himself to exhaustion. But eventually Asuma's team were mopped up. The redhead wished that he could have seen the smoker's reaction to having his team so heavily outclassed, but then he supposed he would have to wait and see how his own team fared. What followed was a painfully mediocre showing between a team from Taki and a team from Kusakakure. The leader of the village and the Hokage chatted amicably throughout as the Taki team narrowly took the win by the skin of their teeth, nearly poisoning themselves in the process, but it otherwise passed without fanfare, leading back into a far more interesting match, at least to the Namikaze. He watched with great interest, and not just because he had a bet riding on this match. As his team stepped up in front of Kurenai's, the two familiar trios sizing each other up. However, there was little Naruto could do at this point. He had trained them as well as he could, and they had witnessed how Team 8 fought. It was up to them now. To say the match started with a bang, though, was an understatement. Just moments after the Proctor's arms fell, a bright white explosion erupted on the arena floor. Some of the twitchier shinobi in the crowd reached for their weapons only to realize it was part of the Team 7 tactics. Sasuke had dropped a flashbang, spreading blinding light in all directions. Hinata, in the midst of her preemptive attack, cringed back, rubbing at her useless eyes rubbing at her uselessly as her sensitive jutsu took the brunt of the damage. Trust Sasuke to attack a fellow jutsu user where he knew it hurt. Shino was the only one on the opposite team to remain undaunted, his sunglasses and high-collared jacket shielding him from the worst of the attack. He spread his arms, pouring out a deluge of Kikai to form a barricade between Team 7 and the cringing Hinata before they could make use of their surprise tactic. However, he saw Sasuke smirk too late, and the boy suddenly took a bracing step back and began flashing through hand seals. He wasn't alone, though. In the same moment he stepped back, Ame rushed forward, her fingers lightly twitching on her blade's hilt. Fire release, great fireball! Sasuke called out over the cacophony din and of Shino's insects, nearly drowning out Ame's own cry. Wind release, gale slash! In a coordinated and equally well-practiced maneuver, Ame suddenly dropped to the ground, skidding on the dusty floor. Beads of sweat percolated across her body as Sasuke's fireball, barely 2 feet off the ground, roared over her body. In the same instant, though her blade lashed out, the faint hue and green blur around the steel lost in the orange inferno above her. What didn't go missing, though, was the combination of attacks results. The blade of wind smashed right into Sasuke's fireball, and instead of slicing through it like one might expect, It seemed to only be absorbed within the raging sphere. The enormous jutsu swelled for a moment before counteracting, its flames becoming a scorching white for a single instant before exploding outward. Ame was only stopped from falling prey to the rapidly expanding flames when she dug her sword into the ground, using it as a leverage point to fling herself back towards her team. Shino's insects, on the other hand, weren't so lucky. The veil he had created using almost two-thirds of his entire hive were almost entirely immolated. Unable to take the intense heat from the combined attack, the crowd were shocked into silence. Even the jonin in the crowd dropped their jaw at the display of teamwork. Combination attacks were notoriously difficult to pull off. That level of synchronicity rarely existed outside of partners for years. Otherwise, the timing had to be impeccable. It made many wonder just what kind of monster had trained such genin. Up in the Kage box, Naruto rubbed his nose, having felt a mild sneeze come on, but quickly squashed it, feeling as though he wanted to smile for some reason. It wasn't over yet though. As Ami retreated back to the safety of her squad, she had to follow Sakura to take a look at her arms. She had been lightly burned when she brought her hands up to take the brunt of the heat from the fire and wind attack, forcing Sakura to heal them. Her synchronicity with Sasuke might be enough to pull the maneuver off, but it was far from perfect. However, Team 8 were not idle, and as soon as the attack had dissipated to bright glowing embers. Akiba was there, spinning through the smoke and the still fallen bodies of Shino's hive. Sasuke's eyes were able to perfectly track him in his tornado-like spin. However, he was too far away to do anything. Even though he could see the boy's trajectory, it didn't help that at that moment Hinata had apparently recovered enough from the flashbang and was rushing towards him at high speed. Her usually cold expression marred into an irritated frown. Sasuke took satisfaction from the hint of red he could see in her eyes from where she had been fiercely rubbing at them right before she closed the distance between them, and their hands became blurs of motion. Sakura and Ame were facing their own problems, though as Kiba suddenly interposed himself between the healer and her patient, they only had enough forewarning to push off one another, letting the spinning Inuzaka crash down between them before ricocheting off the ground and spinning off again. However, they had not noticed the identical twirling vortex hiding in his shadow, and Ame only had enough time to bring her sword around before it crashed right into her. The spinning gray blur of claws and fangs ground against her blade, forcing her feet to carve shallow trenches in the ground as she was forced back. Eventually, though, Kiba, or possibly Akamaru in a hinge, lost his momentum, coming to a disoriented stop. Ame lashed out, but apparently he wasn't that disoriented and was able to bring a clawed hand up to divert the strike. From there, they descended into a rapid flurry of clashes, each sending sparks into the air. Ami was controlled and focused, her feet only moving enough to put power behind her strikes or move her into range. Kiba, on the other hand, was feral, wild, and unpredictable, moving all over the place at high speed in an attempt to overwhelm her. There was no clear advantage there. Over on the other side of the arena, Shino was still reeling from the loss of his insects, trying to muster up some kind of response from the hive within his body. However, in his panic, he failed to notice that Sakura no longer lay where she had fallen after Kiba's abrupt attack. His only sign that something was wrong were the ever so faint tremors in the ground below him. It wasn't enough, though. Hands suddenly wrapped around his ankles out of nowhere, and in the next moment he was pulled roughly into the ground until only his head remained free. Hakura looked practically happy with herself as she sunk out of the floor to his side a moment later, only to wince, throwing her body to the side as the second Kiba duel spun past her, grazing her arm. He ricocheted off the ground and flew right back at her. But this time she was ready. Her breathing suddenly picked up, not becoming heavy, but becoming faster nevertheless. Her toes pawed the ground once, then again, just like Naruto had shown them. The next few seconds seemed to take place in slow motion for her as she stepped to the side at the moment the copy of Kiba flew past her. She could almost see it, the blur and fuzzy outline of his body as he rotated through the air, even the look of mild surprise he bore as she seemingly sidestepped the fast attack with ease. In the next moment, though, a smirk split the pinkette's face as she lashed out. her punch catching the Inuzaka face smile mid-spin. Immediately, the copy crumpled around her fist, the momentum of his spin acting against him in the split second as it was abruptly brought to a stop. His body disappeared in a puff of smoke, a moment later replaced by a growing white dog that could only yip in surprise before being sent careening across the arena. Everything followed suit from there. Kiba looked across at the sound of Akomaru's cry, giving Amir the opportunity to suddenly enter his guard. In an impressive display of rather odd swordsmanship, she suddenly buried her blade into the ground, bending it back as she stepped up onto the hilt. When the steel snapped back into place, she used the sudden jolt to kick Kiba as hard as she could right in the cheek. The Inuzaka was rudely sent flying back, an action not missed in the corner of Sasuke's periphery. A smear crossed Uchiha's face as he feinted to one side, drawing Hinata across in what normally would have been a risky and reckless move. Luckily for him, the Harris took the bait, being drawn in by the chance to finally finish their previous stalemated taijutsu bout. In her focus, she missed her own teammate crashing into her back until the last moment. It was enough to put her off balance, and a brutally efficient flurry of punches and kicks later, she was lying beaten and on the ground by Sasuke's feet. Then silence. Cheers shattered through that silence quickly enough, though, as people realized it was over and Team 7 had won. Even the trio in question seemed rather dazed about it all as they were led off and the next two teams were brought on to replace them. In Sakura's case, it was more literal. That last move was exhausting and a bit rough on her body. Naruto, on the other hand, had the brightest, proudest grin splitting his features. Even despite the shocked looks on the Hokage, the Mizukage, and Shibaro's faces. Naruto-kun, just what have you been teaching those three? Hiruzen finally managed, nearly choking on his pipe after seeing the most flawless display of teamwork since himself had stopped teaching his own Genin team. The redhead waved him off as he leaned back, a satisfactory smirk on his face as he looked up at the sky. Don't worry, Hiruzen. It's nothing my own sensei wouldn't have taught me at their age. Naruto laughed dismissively only to receive a deadpan stare from the older Kage. Naruto, you were an Anbu captain at their age. You didn't have a sensei. Hiruzen said in monotone, making Naruto's easy smile twitch a little. Ah, you caught that, huh? The redhead chuckled sheepishly, still under the expected gaze of the Hokage. Yes, do call me the professor. Well, yeah, they do call me the professor for a reason. The Hokage shot back with a smirk, once again mouthing his pipe in that flawless, all-knowing old man impression. Well, in any case, I'm sure we're all in agreement. It was quite the display. May finally concluded, seemingly getting over her own shock to enjoy the latest display of her own village's up and coming talent as they faced off against the Taki squad. The Hokage chuckled with a small inclination of his head, only to frown a moment later, his already deep-set features wrinkling further, his eyes widened suddenly through as a short tanto pierced the back of his chair and subsequently his chest. There was a startling moment of silence in the Kage box as everyone simply stared at the Matsunobe standing behind the old man, blade still firmly in hand despite the fact it was driven hilt deep into the Hokage. End of chapter 29.